Excellent. Thank you very much, Attorney General, for your kind words. And Mr. Bailiff, distinguished guests, thank you very much for your invitation to address you all today. What have I done? It wouldn't be a gathering of Legislative Council without something disastrous going wrong, and I'm sure when I meet you over dinner tonight I'll be able to regale you with some of the stories of our many drafting conferences abroad, but that is another topic. Good afternoon, as I say, Mr. Bailiff, Attorney General and distinguished guests, and I am so pleased that Lucy invited me to address you today on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the establishment of an independent drafting office for the States of Jersey. It makes me feel really old because the age of your office is almost the entire time I've spent legislative drafting, so that's certainly something to reflect on as well. But to have a high-performing team of drafters to turn Jersey ministers' policies into clear, accessible law is essential to good government. The legislative drafters of the States of Jersey are well known and respected far beyond the island of Jersey and punch very much above their weight. Much of this is down to Lucy's leadership and the leadership of the office by her predecessors. She's a very well-known council member of the Commonwealth Association of Legislative Council, the organisation which I led for 2 years, and she's given presentations to many international audiences. The most memorable and most recent of these was an excellent presentation on policy making and legislation in Zambia, which combined great humour with effectiveness. And if you're familiar with the Four Candles sketch performed by the two Ronnies, that gives you some sort of idea of how she made her point. So I'm quite keen to get Lucy to give that presentation to perhaps some of our new members of the Assembly coming in so they can see how perhaps they might develop their private members' bills and taking a little bit more account of the detail of the policy that they have to think about. So Lucy has kindly given me a free rein on what I might talk to you today about, and I'll not take up very much of your time. Let you all get back to that planning debate. Very familiar with those in our own assembly. So the topic I've chosen today is a particular obsession of mine, that of legislative stewardship and the role of legislative drafters, or more properly, as I think, legislative council in supporting the rule of law. And this talk follows on, and it's a much more general talk than one I gave a number of years before to the government of New Zealand, who were doing a lot of interesting things in terms of legislative stewardship. As you know, I was first legislative council for 8 years in Northern Ireland, and my successor, Alex Gordon, is here today, and he's doing a very able job of leading the office after me. So I had experience not only in drafting Northern Ireland legislation, both under direct rule and the bills of the Assembly, but working with Westminster colleagues on a lot of the major constitutional reforms, so working on those UK acts. But I also had the pleasure of working for a time in Gibraltar on legislation there, mainly commercial legislation, financial services, and also in the Republic of Ireland working on fisheries legislation, which was strangely contentious, and an international border had to be sorted out there. So my first concern as first legislative council was, of course, the delivery of our legislative programme, as it is for all of you. But I was also very deeply concerned about the larger impact of my role as the leader of a drafting office on the statute book as a whole of Northern Ireland, and the ability indeed of citizens to access the law as easily as possible. Now, as Attorney General, I have, of course, an overall responsibility to protect and uphold the rule of law. And that includes a responsibility to ensure that the law is accessible to the public. So I'm fortunate to be able to continue my obsession with Alex's help in my new role, and I'm amazed just at the queries that I do receive from ministers, I would say, and indeed the courts. Would be 80% of them would be really about statutory interpretation and the constitutional issues arising from that. And one of the things I've enjoyed most as Attorney General is being invited by the courts to assist judges in their interpretation of the law in some quite important constitutional cases. So that is something that I hadn't quite expected to be doing, and it is a great privilege to be able to do that. So I'm continuing with my battle to promote proper legislative stewardship in any government that I can. It is absolutely vital to good government on the protection of constitutional values. So I'll start by asking what we mean by legislative stewardship. I think that the concept of legislative stewardship becomes so ingrained in those who draft legislation that it becomes almost subconscious, and we don't try to frame it or mention legislative stewardship when we draft. When we describe what drafting officers do, we focus on the most obvious aspects of the work, i.e. writing the law, which is a pretty big responsibility, because that's the most the easiest thing to understand. But it is very important that we are able to describe and explain what legislative stewardship is and the role of drafters in securing that, as that should be a very important factor in influencing those who make our laws. Speaking from my own experience as a former drafter, the concept of legislative stewardship is very often invoked as a last resort to persuade a minister not to follow a course of action which he or she might later regret when there is an alternative involved. I have had ministers come to me, there were two of them, these are former ministers, I must say, where I have really battled with them quite hard to try and persuade them not to do things. And in one case, one told me after the event he was very glad because he might have had to have resigned if he hadn't actually followed my advice to him at that time. So I think it would really help the legislative process if we our politicians were more aware of our role in that while we were able to spell it out. So I thought it would be useful if we looked at a number of issues today. First of all, what do we mean by legislative stewardship? Secondly, how do Legislative Counsel exercise that important legislative stewardship role? Thirdly, what difficulties do drafters face in doing these? And fourthly, how can these be overcome and how can others involved in the legislative process help with that? The concept of legislative stewardship is a rather wide one. Guardianship of the statute book as a whole has traditionally been one of the principal responsibilities of drafting offices, and it is one of the reasons why I think legislative drafters should more properly be referred as legislative counsel rather than drafters. While Parliamentary Counsel, Legislative Counsel draft bills and play a key role also in managing the process in having bills enacted, their role in relation to legislature is a much wider one. So thinking of what legislative stewardship is, it's hard to think of an exhaustive set of principles, but I think it does involve the following. First of all, ensuring legislative quality, pretty obviously, to protect the citizen and support the rule of law. Secondly, positively aiming and helping to keep bad law off the statute book, which is an unrecognised role very often when it's performed well. It should be seamless. You shouldn't be seen as a legislative drafter in perhaps trying to do this, but it is important. It also involves carrying out a rigorous analysis of policy proposals to ensure that they are robust, workable and fit for purpose before transposing them into law. And it involves ensuring the coherence of the statute book and avoiding unnecessary complexity, not just dealing with the law currently being progressed, but thinking of its effect on the future of the statute book. And of course, it also involves the protection of the integrity of the statute book and ensuring that statute law is accessible. So I will talk a little bit about the precise role of Legislative Counsel in relation to each of these. So the first principle is that of ensuring legislative quality. Good law, whether it's a common law made by judges or statute law made by the legislature, underpins, of course, all of our constitutional values. It's a duty of Legislative Counsel to draft legislation of a high standard which is accessible because it is a fundamental principle of the rule of law that the citizen must know and understand his or her rights as well as his or her obligations, ignorance of the law being no defence, and good quality legislation which is easily accessible enables this. It's neither possible nor desirable to spell out exactly what good law is, but it does have a number of characteristics. It must be necessary and as minimal as possible to reduce complexity. It must be clearly drafted, and it should be consistent with current and up-to-date drafting styles and international standards of good practice. And I suppose a huge ambition I would have, which will never be realised, would be if we had a very standardised way of setting out the laws in as many countries as possible, so that whether it's businesses or citizens can perhaps read the law more easily. So looking at legislation having to be necessary, legislation really should be, of course, the last resort, and policymakers need to ask themselves whether legislation is the most appropriate way to achieve their policy objectives. In many cases, there are alternatives to creating new legislation, and they might actually better achieve the policy objective. New legislation may be unnecessary because the subject matter is already covered by the common law or indeed existing legislation, though that may not be apparent to the lawmakers at the start. Before commencing any legislative project, of course, policymakers need to ensure that the proposal does not duplicate or overlap with other legal powers or remedies. It can, of course, be difficult to dissuade politicians from making law which we might think of as being strictly unnecessary, but there may be a political imperative to do that. And of course, that's a very difficult and sensitive relationship to manage, and but it has been pretty successful, I think, in Northern Ireland. It takes a lot of parliamentary or assembly time to make legislation, and it takes a lot of resource and expense, and unnecessary legislation, of course, at the other end does create burdens for businesses and industry, let alone individuals. It's much easier to make law in the first place than to repeal it, and it can take years to secure a parliamentary slot to undo things. The easy way out, of course, is very often to allow a sweeping power to make regulations to tidy anything up further down the line, but my experience has often been that it's hard to put the pressure on to get those regulations made that bit later, but I would never lose sight of them. And in the UK, the Commons Political and Constitutional Reform Committee some years ago proposed that a draft code of legislative standards might require those bringing forward legislation to explain why legislation, rather than any other means, is necessary to achieve their policy. That was never adopted, but it does remain good practice in the UK, and in Northern Ireland we have a formal requirement that when policy proposals are brought forward, that is covered in the surrounding documentation. So in Northern Ireland, much as I think as in Jersey, Legislative Counsel do not receive instructions from lawyers. Is that right, Lucy?
Mostly, yes.
Except in relation to law reform bills when those come through. So it often falls to Legislative Counsel to identify alternative ways of delivering policy to avoid unnecessary legislation having to be made. So that is quite a burden on Legislative Counsel, which many would not be aware of, and it can also happen at a fairly late stage in the lawmaking process, which can be quite disruptive. So Legislative Counsel, I think, like to be involved at the beginning of the process, or at least we certainly do in Northern Ireland. That may vary, but I think it is a good idea so that is looked at as early as possible. Legislative quality also, of course, requires legislation to be clearly drafted and as simple as possible, and Legislative Counsel use plain language as far as possible to achieve that. Although we all know that there can be tensions between simplicity and effectiveness, we do have to use technical legal concepts to achieve very precise legal results, but we try as far as possible to ensure that appropriate language is used as far as possible. And I mean, we've decades of talking about this in Counsel. We never really got to the solution to making everything just as clear as we would like, and as part of the political process as well. But drafters also consider the structure of every bill very carefully. And I think it's interesting that in Ireland you have a process where you have heads of bills rather than perhaps what we would call instructions, which set out an initial structure, which of course the drafter can, I think, depart from. Is that right? But generally, drafters thinking of that structure is very, very important, not only for the law that you're drafting right now, but thinking of how that might be repealed or amended in the future, so you could easily take large chunks out, replace them without disrupting the whole of the building blocks. It's just sort of reminding me of the Lisbon Treaty, but none of us have ever had to do anything like that, where we're completely at sea when we come back to look at the structure of something. So it's a bit like really an engineer designing a bridge, or I think in Lucy's case it was a conservatory you were procuring, was it, Lucy, in your famous sketch? We need to take account of which parts of the law are going to be replaced first and make that as easy as possible. Drafters, of course, use navigation aids more and more frequently, so you have to balance putting these into the statute book to make the law easier for the reader. On the other hand, you will have to get rid of said signposts at some later stage when amending or repealing, so that's a finely balanced thing to consider. You want to declutter the statute book and not add too much. And there are constraints of all kind on the extent to which we can use plain and simple language. Sometimes, again, politicians with whom I work very closely like to use particular language, and there's always a way of accommodating that, and that could be as clear and simple indeed as any of the language that the drafters would use. The difficulty also that drafters have is when amendments are introduced in a legislature and the drafters have no sight of them, and maybe has to graft obtrusive amendments to those amendments, and can really only do their best. So you have to be thick-skinned, I think, as a drafter, because we've heard criticisms of drafting, which I'm sure the drafters in this room would explain as perhaps better aim maybe at the policy rather than the words, perhaps, but that's a debate we can have over dinner. I'm sure we have plenty of examples to argue about. But drafters rarely start with a clean sheet. In fact, it's lovely to have what I would call a narrative bill, where you start and you tell a lovely story. But that is not, of course, easy to do. And I spent about a year and a half dealing with parading in Northern Ireland, which, as you'll know, is a very contentious issue. And we had I thought it was a very well drafted act which dealt with this. Good story to be told. You could read it plain and simple. Of course, what you don't see is all of the common law in relation to public order offences, the other statute law, and it's quite a difficult field to navigate. So we don't have a clean sheet, and it's lovely if you're a drafter and you do get a bill and you can start from scratch. The legislation you're amending may be very old, and indeed up until fairly recently, even though we have gender neutral drafting, old statutes would sometimes be amended in the original language for consistency, but that was a very brief thing. We also have in Northern Ireland, we've had so many constitutional changes that we've all sorts of laws. We've acts of the old Irish Parliament, acts of the Parliament of Great Britain and Ireland, the Act of Union recently. It was subject to a lot of judicial scrutiny, Acts of the Northern Ireland Parliament and now Acts of the Northern Ireland Assembly, and of course it's all compounded by Brexit as well, where we will still be transposing EU directives. So it's often attractive to a drafter to maybe do things in a different way to make the law much clearer, but you're again constricted by parliamentary time. And I remember, sorry to mention planning again, but it seems to be the topic of the day, and a relatively neutral one. I remember having to draft an enormous planning act at the very end of a mandate, and really I would have rather had 3 separate acts dealing with 3 separate issues that we were dealing with in the planning act, and instead of that we were really forced into applying some provisions to other provisions of the Act, which is something that drafters absolutely hate, but needs must, the law had to be made. And I've also mentioned legislation having to be drafted to current standards, and of course drafting style is constantly evolving. And as I say, I know that the Jersey Legislative Council and Jersey drafters are very keen attendees at all the events of the Commonwealth Association of Legislative Councils, so that certainly helps as well. Keeping bad law off the statute book is much more difficult because the critical analysis of the policy has to be conducted in a way that is diplomatic and done in partnership with all of the players in the system, both the House authorities, politicians, the drafters, the legal advisors, and everyone else. So that can be difficult to do. Now, don't worry, I'm nearing the end here. Policy development, again, in Jersey, when, as in Northern Ireland, you often find perhaps that policy analysis needs a little more attention and detail. I think it's quite important that you have very clear processes set out so that everybody knows that this is a very objective way of reaching an effective end in the legislation being drafted as well as it can. And it's also important for Legislative Council to point out when legislation may read well, but it doesn't have the intended effect because of technical drafting defects that are not visible to the reader or lay drafter. This would quite often happen in relation to perhaps private members' bills, or again amendments tabled by backbenchers because they don't have the assistance that they really need to draft those bills, and in jurisdictions other than our own. I know that I've seen legislation that's been drafted that technically isn't really legislation at all, or perhaps the law is contained in schedules which don't actually technically form part of the Act, or it will never come into operation. So again, that's a role of Legislative Council, exercising stewardship in helping those who do not have assistance to make good law. And I think even things like the titles of acts and the trying where you can to make sure that they are as self-contained as possible also helps. I'm thinking again of the interaction between the primary and the subordinate legislation, getting the balance right. One thing that we're very often asked to do in Northern Ireland is to replicate legislation that already exists in the UK or Ireland or elsewhere, and I'm sure that's a very common thing. But that legislation, of course, needs to be read in the context of the jurisdiction in which it is in place, and that, again, is not as easy as it seems, and very frequently drafters are asked to do that, and that requires quite a lot of work too. And again, just coming back to perhaps private members' bills, which have been trying to steer away from slightly. The members of the Assembly only have a very limited access to drafters, and they may have a contract drafter who does not reasonably enough have the interest of the whole of the statute book in mind. And I suppose that the thing that a dedicated drafting office does is, you know, that if you're drafting today, 5 years down the line, you might be amending your own legislation. So if nothing else, self-interest is important in achieving that as well. And I also think it's an important principle of legislative stewardship that the statute book itself has a lot of integrity, because the judges, when reading statute law and interpreting it, have to be able to rely on it, so they don't have to fill any gaps that they see in the legislation and try and work out what the legislation is intended to do. So there's plenty of case law on that. So Legislative Counsel often may ask rather nosily about the possibility of government actually implementing the laws that they're drafting. That is none of their business in a sense, but if that legislation is not commenced, there could be real problems. First of all, there's an expectation from the public, but also it can just sit in the statute book for perhaps decades, and then it creates a lot of confusion when, again, government has to work around that, draft around it, and it just creates layers of confusion. So I must say I was very attracted to the principle that they have in some jurisdictions, where legislation will automatically come into effect if there has been no commencement provision, say for a period of 2 years. But I've seen some recent bills where I've been quite glad actually that there is a stay of execution. So sure, Alec knows exactly what I'm talking about. So it gives a little bit of time maybe for some things to be sorted out. And of course, the end of the mandate's a great time for rushing everything through. And I think our Speaker has been very generous with the number of extra bills that he has allowed in on this occasion, and particularly private members' bills. But most of all, I think for my role as Attorney General in ensuring that legislation is accessible and supports the rule of law. As Lord Bingham states in his book, The Rule of Law, the law must be accessible and, as far as possible, intelligible, clear and predictable. He gives 3 reasons for this. 1, so far as the criminal law is concerned, the citizen needs to know what he must do or not do to prevent a criminal penalty being imposed. Secondly, if citizens are able to claim their legal rights and carry out their obligations, they need to know what is required. And thirdly, perhaps less obviously, trade, business and investment are promoted by a body of accessible legal rules and obligations. So legislative quality encourages economic growth. So the accessibility of law, of course, is a constitutional principle of the UK, but also recognised internationally. And I come across this again and again in cases that I have intervened in, where the jurisprudence of the ECHR, of course, relies very, very much on that. So government has a responsibility to ensure that the law is accessible, and Legislative Counsel have, I think, a huge role to play in that. This is not easy, of course, because legislation is voluminous and growing and growing. I don't have the exact figures to date. When I was working closely with leg.gov.uk, they could tell you exactly how many words were in the statute book or how many laws, so I don't have the facts and figures now. And the problem, of course, is compounded that lawyers are generally, I think, not trained to research and interpret statute law in the same way as they are case law. And I think that's changing quite a bit at the universities. So there are a lot of difficulties that Legislative Counsel face in exercising their role in relation to legislative stewardship. So these include poor policy underlying the proposals for bills, the lack of time, of course, for drafting, the complexity of the existing law, the lack of drafting resources. And I think I used to think there were about maybe 800 what I would call fully qualified Legislative Counsel probably in the world, going on our figures from CALC. So it's a very small number of people who are fully trained and putting the effort into training the next generation of drafters is a very important thing. There's also the problem of the potentially unlimited number of bills that can be brought forward, certainly in Northern Ireland, and trying to manage that. So some of the things that I did was to put particular processes in place which help the First Minister and Deputy First Minister to manage that a bit better. We have a lot of pile-ups at the end of the legislative term, which I think we're all coping with at the moment pre-election, and there's sort of an air of excitement about, which I think might encourage what I call flighty amending when it comes to this time. Sure, that doesn't happen in Jersey. And the private members' bills, as mentioned before. We have the constant challenges of devolution, as the Attorney General has mentioned. We've had dips where we haven't had an executive. We don't have an executive at the moment. We've had times we've had no assembly. And I've been involved usually in sorting out a lot of the issues that have arisen when this does happen. So how can these be overcome by legislative drafters? It is absolutely essential for governments to build and maintain dedicated drafting offices with a view to sustaining the supply of high quality legislation to support good governance. There is this huge shortage of trained legislative drafters. And I think looking back on my own career, I did find the first 5 years really, really tough, because I was used to being a litigation lawyer and down at court, and it was great fun and everything, and then suddenly I went to lonely Parliament buildings and had to rely on my own resources. But I'm very glad that I did stick it out, because it was the most amazing training and a most enjoyable career. And I have to say, I really felt that I had found my tribe when I went to Dublin, I think 3 months into the job, and there was a conference in Dublin. It was probably the Statute Law Society, and I just found all of these people from all over the world who were interested in the same thing that I was in. It's a terribly difficult job, because I think as Legislative Counsel you need to be exacting, and you need to be able to deal with levels of detail that most lawyers don't in a wide range of areas, but you also need to be able to see the big picture. So when we're recruiting the Office of the Legislative Counsel, we have tests to establish that you have both of those things, and it's harder than you would think to get good scores there. So I think that building a drafting office is, to me, a bit like building a Premier League football team. When I took up my job as First Legislative Counsel, we had only 2 drafters left in Northern Ireland. And with the support of the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, I was able to build a drafting office almost from scratch. And we now have a team of exceptionally good lawyers. And while I'm AG, Alec is carefully nurturing the next generation, which is really, really important. I know that Lucy has put an awful lot of effort into building up a really, really good team, and very often internationally, and that is really to be treasured. So I think that I'm sure it's true in Jersey and in Northern Ireland, certainly being located in the Parliament building is very conducive to building up good and appropriate relationships with legislators, so that they can come and ask questions. And again, that really helps, I think, in developing the law. And we do have ministers who are determined to deliver good law, and drafters always have their encouragement and support, which is really important. So I think that we've looked thoroughly at the vital role that Legislative Counsel have to play in relation to legislative stewardship, the difficulties that we face, and how we can try to overcome these by working together. The exercise of the legislative stewardship role is demanding, challenging, exhausting, and let's face it, can give rise to a lot of conflict. And it's also frustratingly unrecognised sometimes when it is performed well. I think drafters keep their profiles very low, and I think that's appropriate. But it is a role which is absolutely vital to the protection of the rule of law. So I'm looking forward to further discussions over dinner and drinks later on for those who aren't involved in the way it's ongoing tonight. Thank you very much for listening to me on this your 30th anniversary, and wish you well for the next 30 or 100 years. 50 might be your next celebration anyway, Lucy. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to hearing the contributions from the drafters here and Lucy's fabulous team. So thank you very much.